In this video, we're going to set up Laravel 9 with controllers, commands, queues, and databases on Docker in 2022. And we're going to do that on top of the setup that we introduced in the previous video. And the idea or the goal is to replace the plain PHP proof of concept with Laravel. In detail, that means that we replace the index.php file with a controller that is configured in a routes file and uses a view. The dependencies.php file is replaced with configuration values and environment values. The setup.php file that we use to set up the database is replaced with a command. And the worker.php file is replaced with a job and the native PHP artisan queue work command. To get started, we use the previous branch of the tutorial and we'll now try to set up Laravel from scratch on this host machine. I will run the composer command to create a completely new Laravel project, and that will fail because Laravel requires PHP 8 and on my host machine I only have PHP version 7.4 installed. So we will use the Docker setup to set up the Laravel project because in Docker we have set up PHP 8.1, so that shouldn't be a problem any longer. The make target that we use, make execute in container, we explained in the previous version, and we will proxy a command that we define as an argument and run it in a Docker container. And as we can see, the Laravel project was created successfully. I have used a temporary location for the project because I can't install a project in a non-empty directory. So I set it up in this temporary location and will now move it over from here to the code base where I finally want to have it. Because I'm not going to move it, I didn't install any dependencies. And I also didn't run any scripts because those scripts usually require that the dependencies are installed. Before we move the Laravel project over, we need to clear some things that we want to overwrite. In that case, the public folder, the test folder, the composer files, and the PHP unit test file. And then I run a move command from the temporary location to the codebase directory. I can't run this move command directly because I'm using this wildcard syntax here to move all the files. And the wildcard is something that only is available in bash. So it's basically a file expansion. And that's why I need to run bash -c and then pass the command that I want to run. And I should now have it locally on my machine. Here, for example, you can see that the artisan file is now in the code base. The next step for us to do is copy the .env.example file to .env, and now we should be able to install the dependencies. I say should because this will fail because we're missing an extension that is required in one of the composer dependencies. The Laravel -ignition package requires the curl extension, and that is currently not installed in our Docker setup. So let's fix this by going to the Docker file of our base PHP image and then adding the curl extension. And now let's rebuild the Docker setup and restart the containers. Let's retry to run composer install, and this time the installation should actually go through. And now I need to also execute the scripts that I neglected when I created the project. So I'm running the composer run script command with the post create project. And in this case, it was just generating the app key in the .env file. And I should now be able to see the Laravel default front page when I open my local host in a browser. Refresh. And yes, I can see that Laravel is now basically set up from scratch and running on my Docker setup. Then let's now update the proof of concept to make use of Laravel's internal capabilities. And for that, I'm going to check out the branch of the corresponding part. And then I need to rebuild the Docker setup and then restart it. And when I now refresh the page, then I should see the already familiar interface. And it should work exactly as before. So I can dispatch a job on the queue. It should be picked up by a worker, so the queue itself should now be empty, and it should be inserted in the database. All right, so that works exactly as before. Let's take a look at the code changes. So, first of all, the index.php file is now replaced by the default one of Laravel, but the first place we need to look at is the web routes file. In that I configured a route to the homepage that uses a home controller. So let's take a look in that controller. It's located in the app folder under controllers and then home controller. And in here, I can see basically the same setup as we saw in the previous index.php file. Let's make a side-by-side comparison by bringing up Git and then looking for the index.php file in the public folder. Bring up the history and then open up the file itself. So we can now do like a side-by-side comparison. In the old index.php file, I was checking if a dispatch parameter is given, and if so, a corresponding item was added to the queue. I have the same thing in my controller. The queue parameter was bringing up the items in the queue. The same thing over here. Then the DB parameter would show the contents of the database. I have the same thing over here. And if nothing is given, then the default HTML is displayed with the different options, and I have the same thing over here. So the controller itself is basically equivalent to the previous index.php file. I also mentioned that this will be using views. So what I'm doing here is in all of those branches, I have this private getView method that will return a view, and the view itself is in the home.blade.php defined. Nothing special in here, will simply render whatever content is being passed over here. In the controller itself, the first part to mention here is the dependency injection of the queue manager and the database manager. I like to use dependency injection here. You might usually see the uses of facades. So for example, the DB facade that will under the hood call the database manager, or the queue facade that will under the hood call the queue manager. But I would always recommend to go for like dependency injection to make the dependencies clear. Let's take a look at the configuration of those dependencies. Starting with the database, that is configured in Laravel in the database config file. In this file, we need to take a look at the default configuration option that is configured through the environment variable db_connection, and that references a connection that corresponds to key in this connections array down here. In this case, the one that is interesting to us is the MySQL entry, db host, db database, username, and password. Those values need to be overwritten in the environment file. And this is done through the .env file. Corresponding values can be seen up here. So we're using the MySQL connection. So basically the entry that we just saw in the config array. For the host, we use the string MySQL. The database is called application_db. We use root as a username, and the secret MySQL root password as the password. Where are those values coming from? We use MySQL as host, and that works because we defined that in our Docker Compose setup. So in our Docker Compose.local file, we have a service that is named MySQL, and that will make it available to all other containers under the DNS name MySQL. So that's why we use that exact string as a host name. The database is configured through a default value, so that's why it's application_db. The user is not relevant because we use the root as user, and the MySQL root password is passed in as an environment variable. So for that, we take a look in the .env file of the Docker setup, and here we can see the secret MySQL root password, so the exact same string that we saw in the .env file for Laravel. The next thing to look at is the queue manager, and that is configured in a similar fashion. So in this case, we need to take a look at the queue configuration file. We again have a connection string. It will also need to exist in the connections array as a key. We are going to use the redis entry. The redis entry uses like redis as the underlying system for the queue. It uses the default connection, and the remaining values are just the defaults. This redis connection is also configured in the database.php file. If we scroll down, we can see the redis entry here, and then we see the default redis connection up here. So basically that is the connection that we need to make. So we configure redis itself in the database configuration file, and under the redis key there needs to be a default key, and this default key is now mentioned in the queue configuration in the redis entry as connection. As for MySQL, redis is also configured through environment variables, and the ones to look at is the host entry that is configured through the redis host and the password. And again, we will find those values in the .env file under redis. So the host is set to redis, and the redis password is set to secret redis password. That's the exact same reasoning as MySQL. In this case, we have redis as a service name, and the password is passed in here as a variable that again is configured in the .env file as the redis password. In the previous proof of concept, we were using a dedicated file for that was called dependencies.php. So this file was existing in the previous setup, and in here we created configured objects for Redis and PDO in order to deal with Redis or MySQL connections. Let's go back to the home controller and take a look at the actual implementation of the routes that we have configured. When we use the dispatch query parameter, we use a job under the hood, and this job gets then dispatched on the queue. When we use the queue parameter, we will use the queue manager to resolve the underlying Redis instance, and from there we directly call the command on Redis to get the information about the queue status. In the database, we use the database manager to run select star from jobs query, and down here like nothing special happens. For the database, we are selecting something from a table called jobs. And in the previous setup, we were creating that from scratch. Since we're now using Laravel, we will use a migration for that. Under database migrations, I created a new migration file. And in here, I created the schema for the jobs table. And because of this setup, I can now use like the Laravel native migration commands to run the migration itself. In the previous setup, we were using a script for that is called setup.php. And this script was simply running MySQL statements directly on the PDO connection, and have now replaced that with a command. App commands setupdb command. And as I just mentioned, under the hood, it will use the Laravel native wipe command to drop all database tables and the migrate command to actually run the migrations. I can now use this command to replace my setup.php script. In the previous setup, we were using make for that. So I now need to find the corresponding make target in application setup.make and then replace the corresponding command. So instead of calling setup.php directly, I'm now calling the artisan command. And in the general setup target, I also need to switch the order up here because composer dependencies now need to be installed before I can run the setup-db make command, because it requires like a fully functional Laravel installation. So let's take a quick look by running the command, and it will first drop all database tables by running the wipe command and then run all the migrations again, so that now we have a clean slate and all database tables that we need. The last piece of the puzzle is the worker that we created in the previous setup. So let's take a look at this. It was simply a process that was running in an infinite loop and was polling the queue. And if a value was found, then it would insert this value into a database directly. When we go back to the home controller, then this part was replaced with an insert in DB job. So let's take a look at this job that implements the should queue interface that comes with Laravel, uses a couple of traits that are necessary to make it work, defines a job ID that I need to insert in the database, and then defines a handle method that needs a configured instance of the database manager to then insert the job ID in the corresponding jobs table. When we compare that with the worker, then we've basically replaced this line with the job that we've just seen. We now need to replace the remaining stuff around here, so basically the process that runs in an infinite loop. And for that, we will use a native Laravel command that is called phpartisan queue.work. And that will run a worker for us that will pick up queued jobs on the Redis queue in our case. And in order to make this work, we need to adjust the corresponding Docker container that was defined in the worker Docker image. And the only thing to replace here is the PHP worker command. So instead of using the worker.php file, we're now using artisan and the qwork command. For the proof of concept, I also created this test.sh file that is completely untouched because it only uses make targets. So we should now still be able to run the same script again, and it should still work exactly as before. Once the setup is rebuilt, then we're going to restart the Docker setup, clear the database, that will now use the make target that we've just shown and run all the migrations. Then we stop the workers so that we can see that something is on the queue. Before we do anything, we check that queue and the database are actually empty. So the queue is empty and the database is empty as well. Then we dispatch a job on the queue. Then we check if something is on the queue, which is the case here because we've stopped the workers previously. Then we start the workers, they will process the job queue. Then we check that the queue is empty. Indeed, it is empty. And then we assert that something is now in the database, which is the case here. The proof of concept works exactly as before, but now we're using components that come natively from Laravel. Finally, I would like to take a look at the tests, execute all the tests to see if they are still working. As you can see, I've added a couple of additional tests here. The interesting test is happening here in this home controller test case. In here, we are testing the general invocation of the controller, which means that we check out the home route and we see that it returns a 200 status code and assert a certain text fragment on the page. So if we don't pass any parameters, then we expect to see like the default navigation. If we check the DB, then we expect to see an empty database. If we check the queue, then we expect to see an empty queue. And then it gets a little bit more interesting, like insert the value first, then check the DB route. And now we can see that actually an object is in the database as expected. And then we do the same thing for the queue. So in this case, we create one of our insert in DB jobs and push it on the queue. And then we check that actually the job exists on the queue. You can see that up here in the setup method, I'm ensuring that the database and the queue are set up. And those methods are defined in a test case, in a base test case that I created. In this test case, I provide a method for setting up the database. And the first thing that I do is resolve the database manager from the dependency injection container. So basically from the app helper. And then I first check if I'm actually on the testing connection. So this, I believe, is super important because what you really do not want to do is like erase data on production or on staging or whatever. So this is something that I would always recommend to do, like check in your tests if you're on the correct testing connection. Once we're sure that we actually are on the correct connection, we ensure that the database exists. So this helper method will basically try to resolve a PDO object. If the database that is configured does not exist, then a corresponding PDO exception is thrown that has a very specific error code. We can catch that code and can then use the Laravel native MySQL connector to create the database that we would expect here. I find this is incredibly helpful because I don't really want to take care of creating this testing database. Like I certainly don't want to use a production database, so I need a dedicated testing database, but I don't want to take care of creating that manually. And I really like tests that take care of creating all their dependencies completely independently. Once this is ensured, then we use our setup.db command to create a clean slate. So we will ensure that all database tables are completely empty so that we can run our tests and can guarantee that the result is always the same. And the same is done for the queue. So we will also resolve, in this case, the queue manager, ensure that we are on the correct testing connection, and then we'll run the clear queue command. This is a native command from Laravel, and that will simply ensure that no jobs are on the queue any longer. Now we need to make sure that our tests are actually using testing values. This is done through n.env.testing file. This is documented in the Laravel documentation. So you can basically use this .env.testing file. And if you do, then PHP unit tests will automatically use this file for resolving environment variables instead of the normal .env file. In this .env.testing file, I've configured the database connection. And the important thing to note here is that I've replaced the MySQL connection with a testing connection. And this testing connection has to also be configured in the configuration. In our database config, I have copied the entry for MySQL, named it testing, and I've also ensured that in the .env file, the database, in the .env.testing file, the database is set to testing instead of the default one. And I've done the same for the queue. So the queue connection is now set to testing. In the queue config, I have a corresponding testing entry. And this testing entry now also uses the testing connection instead of the default connection. In the database configuration under redis, I will also find a testing entry that is a copy of the default entry, but in this case uses another database than the default one. So I can ensure that I'm not interfering with anything on production or on my local setup, but I'm instead using dedicated testing values here. I could also run the tests via make target, make test. This will run my test suite on the command line. And that's it for this video. Thank you for watching.